Welcome to New Atlas Live. Today is November 16th, 2023. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano, my co-host. And today we're going to be talking all about President of China, Xi Jinping, his visit to the United States. And I was just, Angela, I don't know, you're in Hong Kong. I don't know if people there were very hopeful for anything. But I remember telling Alex from Reportify Media just yesterday in a live stream, I said, almost certainly there's going to be some sort of power move where right after the meeting, President Biden's going to insult President Xi Jinping or China, and this isn't going to amount to anything. Were you shocked or surprised? And in case people don't know what we're referring to, this is the headline of the CNN article right after the meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. Biden says he still believes Xi Jinping is a dictator. So someone asked him in a press conference after his meeting with the Chinese president, do you think he's still a president? That was his answer. Hold on. Let's see. Well, look, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours. So just, you're different, you're bad. You're different, you're a dictator. We'll call you something to depict you as something bad. Angela, were you surprised at all about any of this?
No, not surprised, but the surprise. Oh, oh my God, that was my phone. So
this always happens. No worries.
Not surprised. You see, it's like whenever Biden is having a meeting with anyone, nobody's expecting anything coming from Biden. You see, when actually you have Xi Jinping coming over to the US, the event is Xi Jinping, not Biden. People ignore what Biden is saying, and they're expecting him to say, to read the script. And here he put a little bit of nuance. He said, well, his government is a dictator, but it's just a different government than ours. So again, this is what surprises me is that Biden has been craving, he's been trying so hard to meet with Xi Jinping, and so Xi Jinping would just not even take phone calls with Biden. Now Xi Jinping comes and he manages to do that. But I think you see, in normal times with a normal leader, Xi Jinping would take it very seriously, but he doesn't, because it's a non-event. Actually, it's almost humiliating, because it's like, well, whatever. You're not the man in charge. You're not in charge of your own brain, and there's no scripts. And you see, it was very interesting. You had Blinken looking at Biden, and you realize Blinken is doing the nurse there. And Blinken was not all there. If you really look closely, Blinken was not all there, and that's my personal opinion. I think he might have, some stash from Zelensky. He was not all there. He was touching his nose. Something was not clear there. What is your opinion, Brian?
I just saw someone coming in late. Yes, President Joe Biden of the United States called President Xi Jinping of China a dictator right after their meetings. People were making jokes about how ridiculous it would be. It was a funny joke, because no one would imagine that it would be that ridiculous and that repetitive, and yet that is exactly what President Biden did. And look, I was on a more serious note. I was talking to Alex yesterday on the live stream, and I pointed this out in a Sputnik International interview about the U.S. is going to meet with China, and we should always be happy to see diplomacy. But as the U.S. is inviting President Xi Jinping to California, what was that?
Nothing.
Okay, yeah. So they're inviting the Chinese president to the United States, but all while they're doing this, pretending to seek diplomacy, they're busy in Southeast Asia, transforming the Philippines into a battering ram against China. I have some news articles. We can go through them, and we could talk about each one of them. They're also continuing with the arming of separatists on Taiwan. despite the U.S. State Department itself recognizing Taiwan as part of China under the One China policy. They've transformed the entire U.S. Marine Corps into a force specifically to fight war with China. But its sole purpose now is to wage war on China and not stopping a Chinese force storming the beaches of California. No, the U.S. Marines will be on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, off the shores of China, in the South China Sea, doing this. So this is what the U.S. is actually doing versus the facade of diplomacy that they're trying to create here. And before we get into these older articles, I just want to refresh everyone's memory. And Angela, you and I, we've talked about this many times over the last couple of years. This is from the State Department's official website, the Office of the Historian. This is a memorandum from 1965 from then Secretary of Defense, I think his name was Robert McNamara, to the then President Johnson. And it says right here, this decision to bomb North Vietnam and the July approval of Phase 1 deployments make sense only if they're in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. So even back in 1965, there was this is what they say, a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And then it says China looms as a major power threatening to undercut our importance and effectiveness in the world, and more remotely but more menacingly to organize all of Asia against us. And then down here, this is very important. This has always been U.S. foreign policy, regardless of who's in the White House and who's in Congress. It says there are three fronts to a long-run effort to contain China. And they, at that time, the Soviet Union, they imagined was containing China to the north, but that obviously isn't the case now. The Japan-Korea front, we know the U.S. has tens of thousands of troops based in both Japan and South Korea. The India-Pakistan front, remember, they were creating the Quad. They wanted India to be part of this this united front against China. And then, of course, the Southeast Asia front, which I've talked about a lot over the years, how the U.S. is trying to coerce governments in this region to cut ties with China. And if they don't, then they go for regime change, try to remove them from power and install a client regime in place that will cut ties with China. Angela, you want to add anything to that? And the color revolution tactics that the U.S. used, they were also using inside China itself. You're in Hong Kong. And if people don't know, you began doing videos and speaking up because you were in Hong Kong when the U.S. was trying to create chaos there with their proxies and their armies of agitators.
So the way they did with China, they tried at different fronts. Very early on, they tried to steer problems. Actually, China did a very smart move when it came to the U.S. They pretended, I think they kind of pretended to be antagonizing the USSR. But China, what China needed back then was to get funding, investment. They did a transfer of technology. So China did pretend that it was going to enter into Western-style democracy, but it was just a way to be closer to their enemies, because they knew exactly that China was the last piece over the next 50 years. Everybody was actually ready for China to re-emerge as this superpower. So the US created different fronts. So antagonizing with the USSR. Very early on, they funded the terrorist movement in Tibet. So the Tibetans actually they were training in Colorado. They were training in Nepal as well. So you had this militia. The CIA actually was funding the Dalai Lama, who's now based in northern India. So that was a front. There was another front, which was the ETIM, which was the Xinjiang movement. That they've been funding through the National Endowment for Democracy. And also you had also in Hong Kong. And also they were hoping to open a fifth column, which never happened in China. But they were very close to succeed in 1989. Keep in mind that
Sorry, Angela, just because people are going to say, no, Angela, you're just saying that because you hate America. This is again, the State Department's official website, Office of Historian Review of Tibetan Operations. And they talk about how the CIA was arming them and they were behind the whole thing. So again, people always accuse me of denying people agency, but I have the evidence, I have the documents that the U.S. is actually behind all of this. And I never make a claim unless I have evidence like this directly from the U.S. State Department. Please continue, Angela. You're making this is a very important point that people need to understand.
I have to say, I'm the same as you, Brian. We do our homework before. I would not sleep if I was to say something which is not sourced. I would not sleep. I did once a mistake. I think I told you once. I confused. I said Hungary was Orthodox, and that because of that for 1 week I couldn't sleep, because I hate doing assumption. We do our homework. So I did read also the autobiography of the Dalai Lama. He actually admits his brother actually says clearly that one of the biggest mistakes of the Dalai Lama was to take CIA money, and so that's one of those personality hijacked. And I think over the years, Dalai Lama wanted actually a rapprochement with China, but again, if they probably have a lot on him, and just to make him fall. So they are hostages. They have those agents pretty much everywhere that they keep hostages. So there was another front which was so they almost managed to have a color revolution in 1989, and 1989 was one of the very first color revolution. Even the person Gene Sharp, who actually wrote the playbook of color revolution, was in Tiananmen Square. So the usual color revolution, it starts with the legitimate claims because China is not perfect and it's hijacked, and then it ends up by having thugs. I mean, they were really thugs running the whole show, and people don't know, but most of the people that died, they didn't die on Tiananmen Square. They died around Tiananmen Square, and most of them were soldiers burned alive.
Yeah,
that's how brutal they were, and nowhere close to what the West claims in terms of that. So China's been attacked all along, and what they did was they were very careful. They studied very closely how those color revolution work, and they were prepared for Hong Kong as well. So Hong Kong, the way it worked in Hong Kong was that before the handover in 1997, you had actually the MI6 and the CIA. They actually planted the seeds for color revolution. So they started funding lots of organization, what they call a civil society in Hong Kong. So you had the teachers unions, you had money to the university. So the whole actually democracy in Hong Kong was hijacked previous to the handover. So there was gradual increase of funding and meddling, and they could do that because there was no national security law. And there was intermediary to that, there was 2014, there was a Occupy Central movement. And then you had this 2019 extremely violent attempt of color revolution in Hong Kong. So China has been attacked all along, and different front. They have a holistic approach. You put chaos into Chinese society. This whole thing about divide and control. They use the ethnic elements, ETIM, Tibetans. They even tried to do Mongolian. There are minority of Mongolian speakers in China, but they mix up completely. They didn't manage to do that. And they even tried in Hong Kong to put these elements, ethnocentric element, which is, Hong Kong people are Chinese. But they tried. With kids, it works. It works with kids. Kids, you tell them, guess what? You are superior to the mainland Chinese. You are more educated. You are superior. And you had kids and their parents being antagonized because the parents, they knew that they were manipulated. It's not, the West is not Hollywood. And ultimately, you look at yourself in the mirror, you are Chinese. You are betraying your own country. So that was the holistic approach that the US had on China. And so China has been ready. What they did was really to look at sovereignty, but much deeper. What we have this we talk about this very often, you and I. A lot of people they had this misconception of thinking sovereignty is only at the border, physical border. But what China did was really work on information space, because that's how you do color revolution. How did it happen in the Arab Spring? Was just, Facebook, was all those social media that those Arab countries didn't manage. And that's how you create a color revolution. You spread fake news, you amplify the algorithm, you work together with Facebook, Instagram, all those US controlled, CIA controlled media, and that's how you create chaos.
Absolutely. And you just said something about how the U.S. is not actually what people see depicted in Hollywood. And I just thought, because we're talking about the APEC meeting and the Chinese president visiting the United States, visiting San Francisco, California, and a lot of people were talking about this. This is from Reuters. San Francisco patches over homelessness, drug abuse for APEC. And it's talking about how they're just covering it up. They're moving them somewhere. We don't know. We don't even really know where they move them. There's a quote in here. Let me see if I can find it. I think I highlighted it. Yes, down here. And it's they quote someone from one of these advocacy groups down here, and they say they do this all the time for the Super Bowl, for important conferences. They sweep them out of sight. They don't do anything to solve homelessness. They don't do anything to solve drug abuse or poverty and poor education, which is the root of all of these problems. And just going back to President Biden calling the president of China a dictator and trying to make it out as if China's an evil place. China's the government in China, I would say, is more representative of the best interests of the Chinese people than anyone in Washington regarding American best interests. As a matter of fact, I think more and more Americans are waking up to the fact that they vote for specific people. They put them into office specifically because they promised during campaign time they're going to stop the wars, they're going to relieve debt, college debt, and do something about healthcare. And then once they get into office, they don't. So if they're not doing this for the people, things that they promised, they're not serving the people. Who are they serving? And if you're not serving the people, are you a democracy, or are you more like a dictatorship where no matter what the people say or want, you do something totally different? You tell the people what's going to happen. They don't tell you. That seems to be pretty much a textbook definition of dictatorship. But I want to get back to what you're talking about, Angelo, the means of coercing these nations, especially here in Southeast Asia, but also Japan and South Korea, and also the administration in Taiwan, putting them on a course that is self-destructive. And we use this reference an awful lot here. This is the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, and it's showing exports and imports by trade partner. And you can see this is for the Philippines. I want to talk a little bit about the Philippines, since they're kind of out ahead of the rest of Southeast Asia, trying to provoke some sort of incident with China now. And you can see between China and Hong Kong, which is part of China, by far their most important export market is China. And in terms of imports, very clearly their most important import partner is China. And yet they're canceling, and I've talked about this in a previous video, they're canceling infrastructure projects with China, rail projects in the Philippines. The Philippines desperately needs infrastructure. It's got a larger population than Thailand, but a smaller GDP because of this legacy of having been a Spanish colony and then an American colony, and then the U.S. interfering and preventing the Philippines from getting its act together, basically. So they're canceling infrastructure projects with China. And down here, they even say it would be much better to deal with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, the U.S. and EU, rather than with China to build these rail projects. these countries don't build rail projects in other countries. Only China is capable of doing this. So what they're saying is that they're not going to build any infrastructure. If they have to work with China, they would just rather have no infrastructure at all. And what this reminds me of is the course of action that Ukraine took from 2014 onward. The U.S. installed the client regime into power. It coerced that client regime to take certain courses of action, extremely anti-Russian, irrationally anti-Russian. Ukraine is practically a part of Russia, historically speaking, linguistically, culturally. So they cut themselves off from Russia. It's also a very important modern economic partner, at least up until 2014. And they destroyed their economy. They plunged themselves into a protracted internal conflict. And now they're in the middle of a proxy war the U.S. is waging against Russia, using them, and they have no country, they have no future, and the U.S. is fully planning and in the process of transforming the Philippines into a proxy, very similar, and also Taiwan. And we've talked about U.S. policy papers regarding Taiwan, how they admit if there's some sort of armed conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, everything on Taiwan is gone. But at least they'll have their political independence, which isn't true because the administration in Taiwan is entirely dependent on Washington, would not exist without Washington. So this is not about Taiwan independence. It has no independence, completely dependent on the U.S. right now. So I always ask people who doubt or who demand that we give the people in Taiwan the ability to decide for themselves, independence. If Crimea can do it, why can't Taiwan do it? Because objectively, it's not in their best interest to do it. They will destroy their economy. They will end up in the middle of a war, and their island will be scoured of industry, infrastructure, and probably also human life. So it's very important to understand the U.S. is doing this right now. Actually, let's look at some of these headlines. And Angela, you can jump in anytime you want. This is all regarding just the Philippines. The U.S. is putting pressure on all countries along China's border in a very similar manner. U.S. military in talks to develop port in Philippines facing Taiwan. Okay, it's very, very provocative. The Philippines is canceling infrastructure projects with China, so we're not going to build civilian infrastructure. Instead, we're going to build military bases and ports with the U.S. military to agitate our largest trade partner. Let's see what else here. U.S. Philippines. Yes,
it's so surprising. Marcos was supposed to be a protege of Duterte, and Duterte had a very balanced approach when it came to China. So you see, even Marcos, before being elected, he was talking about just being non-aligned, and then once elected, you had exactly the opposite that happened. And I would say that I don't know if maybe you can confirm with me, but it seems like we were expecting the opposite in Thailand. A government that was very pro-US, anti-China, and it seems like they are actually having a more balanced approach to what we were expecting. Can you confirm that? Because you're living in Thailand, maybe you can give us your impression on that.
Yeah, actually, you bring up a good point. When Marcos was first elected, I thought he would have a very balanced approach. I thought that, well, okay, he's signing these basing agreements with the U.S. military, but he's going to continue cooperating with China. They'll have these outbreaks of incidents in the South China Sea, but they'll bilaterally manage it with China, just like they did under Duterte. But it seems like, no, that's not what's happening. Someone got to him. And the thing is, they had another candidate. I cannot remember what their name was, but they had another candidate that was just openly vowing to do all of this, is just take this extremely irrational anti-China approach. And they didn't win. Marcos did win, but now he's adopting those policies. It's very similar to how Obama vowed to end all the wars, then he expanded them all and started new ones. Now, regarding Thailand, is very complicated because even though a party that has been a U.S. proxy for a very long time, they got into power, but it's a coalition government with the previous government who is connected to the military and actually indigenous institutions here in Thailand. So it's tempered what they've been able to do and not do. But still, I'm seeing things. There's I can't name the media organization because I live here in Thailand, and even though these media people studied in the West and they think they believe in democracy, if you criticize them, they will use Thai defamation laws to end your life. So I got to be very careful how I say this, but they conducted an interview in Taiwan with the foreign minister, the so-called foreign minister, Joseph Wu, and China, the embassy of China had to make a public complaint about this because it's undermining Thailand's own one China policy. So I don't know if it was this media organization that did this on their own, or this is part of something that the government itself, because the media organization is funded by the Thai government. The problem is, and I pointed this out when I referred to this, so many people now in positions of power or in the media, they got their education in Europe or in the United States. So even if they're not colluding with the US government, they have a bias that is pro-Western. And so they're going to continue leaning in a direction that is completely irrational, leaning toward the US now, today in 2023, almost 2024. It's completely irrational, but they do it because they have this emotional connection with the West that they I guess they don't have with China. So it's very odd, but I would say the vector sum is still positive. They haven't canceled the high-speed rail project, even though it's dragging on, being built together with China. And of course, if we look at the Atlas of Economic Complexity, China is Thailand's largest trading partner, largest source of tourism. They have bought a lot of military hardware from China to replace older American military hardware. It would make absolutely no sense to try to provoke China. It's very clear this is a beneficial relationship, but the US is there to get a client regime into power that will make irrational decisions, just like in Ukraine. Because people say, well, they're not going to do that, but you see that they do. Look at Ukraine. That is an extreme example of what is possible if the US is able to sufficiently interfere in a sovereign nation's political system. So I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Yeah. I think the danger, what we need to highlight is especially the worst case scenario, which is like Ukraine, where you have a US puppet regime, and actually Zelensky is reading the script of the CIA. Is not how much power does he have? Probably the CIA is absolutely everywhere. And what is the biggest risk is not those countries that are hostages and they actually play with time. Sometimes you see there's one thing is you pretend to be US ally, but you're hostage and you playing the clock, because with time things are going to change. That's what we call realpolitik. But when it comes to Taiwan, we've exposed this before. What is worrying is that really when we look at Tsai Ing-wen, she is, to my opinion, she looks very much like a US agent because of these relationships she had very early on. We found those cables from WikiLeaks already 2004, 2005. She was actually having secret meetings with the U.S. Embassy, or the de facto U.S. Embassy, the American Institute of Taiwan, and that's the most worrying element. So she might not be working for the best interest of Taiwan, or at worst, she might be working directly for the U.S. And we've seen this so-called democracy in Taiwan, which has been completely hijacked. You look at the media; they've kicked out all media that are pro-China. There was a color revolution in 2014 called the Sunflower Revolution. But I would say there's a very interesting thing that is happening these days. You have originally you had two parties in the politics of Taiwan. You had the DPP, the pro-US, what they call the pro-independence party, and the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang is the old party that actually left China. They were fighting the communists in 1949. And those are slightly, I would say, closer to China and closer to reunification. And then you have this new party called the TPP. The TPP is actually the second or third force in Taiwan, and they just announced that they are going to play together on the same ticket for the 2024 elections. That puts the coalition of Kuomintang and TPP 10% ahead in the polls than the DPP. So this single element could change the whole dynamic. But again, the containment of China, all this false flag operation might not come from Taiwan. If they cannot manage to get Taiwan on board to fight against the mainland. Fighting against the mainland, it's the trigger. You have several triggers that would actually create a conflict. I think U.S. Army troops in Taiwan could be one. If you have U.S. Army troops, a nuclear bomb being stationed in Taiwan, and the Declaration of Independence. I don't see many more, but those would be the trigger. So if Taiwan is not on board, then they'll find another solution. And I would say maybe a false flag operation with the Philippines. You could imagine there are skirmishes between Filipino boats and Chinese boats just because they're flirting. They have territorial disputes between China
and the U.S. is encouraging this. They're trying to escalate deliberately.
Yeah, you remember? Maybe you can explain. There was this conflict, legal conflict between the Philippines and China, and somehow, I think at some point they find a solution between the two countries. But you had still the U.S. coming in the middle and saying, "No, you didn't find a solution."
Yes. Yeah.
You remember?
Right?
There
was a case at some arbitration courts in The Hague, and it wasn't even Filipino lawyers that lodged it. It was an American legal team that they just created this whole thing, and then they said, see, this arbitration court ruled in the Philippines' favor. The court is not part of the UN or anything like that. So the U.S. was pointing at that, and they were saying China needs to recognize this, and they were going to use that as a point of contention. And at the time, it was President Duterte. He said, "We don't care about this legal case. We had nothing to do with this, except you went and lodged this in our name. We're going to work with China. You're out of the picture. We're going to sit down with China. We're going to resolve this." And then as soon as Duterte was out and Marcos was in, they started this all over again. They're starting to wave around that court case, a kangaroo court in Europe that has, is part of this unipolar order the U.S. has created, and they've got all of these, like the International Criminal Court, all of these facades that make it look like there's this global justice being served, but it's actually serving U.S. interests almost entirely.
Yeah, I just want to add those territorial disputes is not between China and the countries around the region. It's between all those countries in the region. So you have Malaysia and Indonesia. You have Indonesia and Australia. They all have territorial disputes because it's unclear. The laws of the seas. It's and you just to give you another example. You have territorial disputes. Like sea lanes, it's for fishing, between France and England. You have, even up to now, you can check on Wikipedia, you can check territorial dispute between Canada and the US up to now. So, it's you have thousands of those territorial disputes. So in the region, what they're doing is they're just trying to put this on the side. It's there, the problem is there, but let's not focus on that.
What's funny is Taiwan, this U.S. proxy, also rejected this U.S. legal team's court case against China in favor of the Philippines. Taiwan even came out and said, "No, we don't recognize this." But you didn't hear much about that in the Western media. It's always about how China is bad. And our proxies, no matter what they do, we're not even going to talk about it. This is, by the way, Rappler.com. This is a National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. government-funded media outlet, and the founder, Maria Reza, has her own page on the NED's website, and she's got the Nobel Peace Prize. They're trying to sell something when they give someone an award.
She's a party. I'm not sure, but she's actually more active into politics, I've heard. she might. I think they might prop her up for the next presidential election. But
she's very enthusiastic about her pro-American stance, and she's able to keep herself focused on this, which is very hard to find amongst U.S. proxies. A lot of them, it goes straight to their head, and she's very even-tempered. So people like that are extremely useful for the U.S. But again, if you read Rappler and the things that it's proposing, they would just have the Philippines go right back to being a U.S. colony again. And it was literally a colony until 1946. And when the U.S. took over from Spain, the people in the Philippines attempted to fight a war of independence against the U.S., and the U.S. Mass murdered them, brutalized them, tortured them, used violence to subordinate them. That is the real history here. And ever since they got their independence, the U.S. has attempted to reassert itself and coerce the Philippines to make foreign policy decisions, even domestic decisions that don't serve their own best interests. So this is a repeating theme that we see all around the globe. And we're talking about the Philippines and also all across Southeast Asia and East Asia and even Central Asia. The U.S. is doing this all along China's borders and periphery. And they're doing it because the ultimate goal, just like in that 1960s document on the State Department's own website, the goal is to contain China. Has always been the goal, and it will continue to be the goal until these circles of power are gone and someone replaces them who is a little bit more rational.
I just noticed one thing. I was thinking this afternoon is when you look at the U.S. officials traveling around the world, Blinken, Victoria Nuland, especially Victoria Nuland, they're traveling because they are actually trying to steer away countries from Russia or from China. So it's about how we can divide. On the opposite, when you have Chinese officials going around the world, is how we can cooperate, how we can meet peace in some regions. We saw what happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was because of the mediation of China. And China is actually promoting business around the world. So you see those two different approaches. In China is going, at some point, I'm expecting China to step in. Once heads will cool off a little bit, they might step into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So you see, we see the very big difference, and I think I realize that they're taking it is like the adult is back on the table. When you look at how the irrational, emotional, especially collective West is acting, you have the impression that once you have people like leaders like Putin, like Xi Jinping coming to meetings, you feel that you have responsible people around the table, and you can tell whenever Lavrov is going around the world, everybody wants to talk to him. Xi Jinping, the way that he's treated around the world. When you have Biden, even Biden now is just it's no one, just because the people know that he's not in charge. And you have this rejection of this unipolar world. People don't want, some countries don't want to actually follow on the downfall of the U.S. empire. You see now, I think the inflection point is probably Ukraine. Ukraine is the big inflection point. Now there's a distraction. I mean, sadly, a distraction. It's sad. It's extremely dramatic what is happening in Palestine. But the inflection point is Ukraine. Everything is happening. So we need to always when we look at those events, what I call micro event like Ukraine and Palestine, we need to step out a little bit and always look at what is behind that. What is behind that is actually the US and the collective West refusing this power transition, going from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, because that is the big game. That is the big news. And I think those countries are shifting slowly but surely. There's lots of reaction when you look at how, in general, even US allies are behaving now. It would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. just not actually refusing to deal in US dollars, starting to deal in their own currency. That is huge. That is huge. Gaddafi, they killed Gaddafi for this. They killed Saddam Hussein for this. Now you have US allies. You have even Italy accepting to trade into ruble. So you see, it's a slow shift, and it's just about are they going to accept that? Are they going to get rational at some point? And I think we're not there yet. We're nowhere near. So I would say I'm trying to analyze the psychology behind this. If they cannot control, they might turn into rubble. That's my worry. That's what I feel of what is happening. What is happening in Ukraine from day one? They knew that Ukraine would never defeat Russia. But if you can destroy and actually contain Russia, Middle East, you cannot control the Middle East. You see the shifting. All those countries actually, and it started with the Abraham Accord, but then you have, you can see even Israel is actually, and I'm not a fan of Israel and Zionist regime, but they're shifting. They're trying to decouple from the US because they're rational and they're looking at the big picture. You see the Middle East that is getting closer to China. And the ultimate goal in China, they know that they'll never defeat China, but it's going to be a containment, not only of China, but the whole Southeast Asia. So ultimately, I have a feeling that they've lost. And what they did was to take Europe in their own block and trying to destroy whatever they can destroy. And maybe we might end up into this Cold War approach where you had one side and the other. But with the big difference is that the Cold War was USSR building the wall. Now, isolating themselves is the collective West, which is isolated itself. And they've completely hijacked Europe. Economically, politically, everything has been hijacked in Europe, and they needed a conflict with the USSR, with Russia, just to cut completely. And now Europe cannot do anything without the US because it's dependent in terms of energy, in terms of security. They've missed it completely. This shift in geopolitics.
Yeah, and it's very important that people zoom out and they look at how all of these conflicts are connected. It is not, none of these conflicts are isolated and unfolding on their own. They're all interconnected. And we see the US coming to this realization that, oops, our proxy war in Ukraine, we've lost that. And we're going to have to do something very extreme to change that, or that is going to be a defeat. And they have two options. They can just try to make make it as expensive, raise the cost as much as possible for Russia to continue achieving its objectives in Ukraine for as long as possible, or they could try to do some sort of intervention, or even we hear a lot of talk about just bringing Ukraine into NATO, forget that it's in the middle of a war and it's over 20% of its territory now belongs to Russia, forget that, bring them into NATO, and then cite Article 5 to wage some sort of more direct war with Russia. That is crazy, but that's one of their only options left. And you see them trying to go back to diplomacy with China, and you're just wondering what is going on in their mind. Do they think that if they start repairing ties with China, China will be more willing to put distance between itself and Russia and just kind of let the US take Russia off the board? I mean, this is probably what they're thinking, however unrealistic it is. But I think China realizes that if you take Russia off the board, they're going to put a client regime into power in Russia or wreck it. Like you say, Angela, if we can't have it, we'll just burn it to the ground. And they'll cut China off from Russia, and they'll have a much better chance of actually really isolating China. And again, from a rational person's perspective, none of this makes sense. From their perspective, they are supremacists. They believe they are the greatest people on earth, and they see this non-white nation inevitably going to surpass them, and they cannot accept this. Not because there's anything wrong with this. They just personally, psychologically, politically, they cannot accept this. And so they're going to do increasingly irrational, desperate, and dangerous things to try to reverse this, even if it's impossible for them to do so. Well, I mean, look at Ukraine and look at all the ideas that they've been coming up with and how reckless a lot of them have been and how it's made absolutely no difference. They're still going to lose the proxy war, but they keep pushing anyway because these are irrational people. We've talked about the psychology, the competence or lack thereof of these people running the West, United States and Europe. These are people who are unqualified. They don't understand how the world works. They don't understand how the military works. They don't understand how basic logistics and factories work. They don't know how anything works. This is like a spoiled child that's inherited the family business and they're running it into the ground. That is the leadership class in the West right now. And they're going to try to run the world into the ground. You said, Angelo, burning, destroying everything. I think that's pretty much what they're trying to do in the Middle East. They see that the Middle East is transforming. I saw a comment in the comment section, the Middle East is coming into their own. The U.S. isn't going to allow that. So if they cannot reverse it, they will just destroy everything. Look at Myanmar, next door to Thailand here. They couldn't get their client regime back into power, so they're just burning the whole country down. They're just funneling money and support and weapons into the opposition. And the opposition is just burning everything to the ground. They're not going to win. Even if they win, what will they be presiding over? So this is just them wrecking Myanmar. And that is their plan. If they cannot create a united front in Southeast Asia against China, they'll just try to divide and destroy the region as much as possible. So that's what we're seeing right now. That's what we're watching unfold right now. Yeah, go ahead, Angelo.
There's an escalation. Actually, it's good that you bring this point of Myanmar. There's an escalation, especially close to the border with China. And I remember I've been into that region at the border. There's a town called Rayleigh. And the whole region is actually, it's almost like a no man's land, basically, that and China is a huge country, and there's a very high degree of autonomy. And here you have, it's one of the minorities in China that they are Burmese. And you have, it's within this area of what you call the triangle, where you have lots of opium trading, illegal trading. And there's been forever a guerrilla. You have a ancient, like I think Mao era guerrilla, and so China has a lot of a very big minority of Burmese that actually escaped because of the civil war, and there's a risk for China to have an influx of refugees, and this could actually destabilize a little bit the border with China. So before, China was cooperating with the Burmese Myanmar's army, which is called the Tatmadaw, and now you have the opposition to the Tatmadaw are both factions that are financed by the U.S. You have the guerrillas. I think one of the biggest one is the Karen, right? Maybe you can confirm. And you have this U.S. sponsored opposition, which is where you have Aung San Suu Kyi, which was a real U.S. puppet that was put in place by the U.S. and to antagonize China. So for China, I think for China, what's the most important for China when it comes to Burma is not only to have no problem at the border, but it's important to have this pipeline that they have, which is helping to bypass the Malacca Straits. And you see, when you had Aung San Suu Kyi in power, she was probably 90% of her time she was focusing on how she could destroy all the contracts that China had with Myanmar. And she was working against her own country and for the US. And she was actually selling. They were together with all those. George Soros was actually there. Remember this task force that they had. Yes. Once she had power, there was a task force. John Kerry was on the task force with George Soros was there as organized by Asia Society. And if you read that paper, it's online. Task Force, Asia Society, Myanmar. They were actually planning on how we are going to pay back our US masters. We are going to sell all Myanmar valuable assets to all the BlackRock and George Soros. That's how they do. And then so they hijack the whole democracy, and then it's over. It's over. That country is going to be destroyed, and no more sovereignty. No more sovereignty. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Aung San Suu Kyi's inner circle were all white guys from Australia and the UK, and one of them was actually currently working at the UK Foreign Office, Home and Foreign Office, or whatever they call it, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, essentially. And what does that tell you? I mean, she was clearly a puppet, and she was selling the country out. And people are like, well, she was meeting with China. If you go look at the economy of Myanmar, it's completely dependent on China. She has no choice. Even as she's pulling the plug on everything, you can't do it overnight. It's a process that takes time. So people just meeting each other doesn't really mean anything. President Xi Jinping just met President Joe Biden. Does that mean China and the U.S. have a good relationship? Not even close, not even remotely. So we have to look behind everything and follow the money. And in Aung San Suu Kyi's case, her political movement was built up by the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Her inner circle were literally white guys walking around like viceroys in Myanmar. So this is the game that the U.S. is playing right now, even as they invite the Chinese president to the U.S. to pretend to be diplomatic. And then what they usually do is they're pretending to be diplomatic. They're provoking conflict with China. When China reacts to these provocations, they say, see, we invited them to California. We wanted diplomacy, and they want war. They're belligerent. And now we have to go and fight war. No choice. Wasn't our choice. It was China's choice. They did this with Iran. They did this with Russia. They're doing this with China.
Yeah, I think we always have to focus on actions. I mean, words, I think Chinese, they're very pragmatic. It's like, well, you can tell whatever you want. Ultimately, it's about really your actions. And the actions are right there. You see those policy papers written by think tanks, which are actually financed by the military industrial complex. The plans of the US are very clear. They were clear for Ukraine, they are clear for China, and you can see the investment, massive investment that are poured into to contain China or to do bad publicity when it comes to China. Just to give you one example, there's a budget of $500 million US only on putting bad publicity on China related to the Belt and Road Initiative. So just imagine you have homeless in the US. You have so many problems. You need to rebuild your infrastructure because it's completely destroyed, right? Now you're paying $500 million because you cannot compete with China. And the only way you can look okay is by doing bad publicity on China. I like to make the example of Tonya Harding. Remember this skater? She could not compete. She was not good enough. So she blew up the kneecap of her opponent. That's how they do. Yeah. Why? Because China is playing. See, China is playing the game, the game of the collective West. They're playing the capitalist, right? You wanted China to be capitalist, to play with the same game. They know everything. They did everything right. They got the investment. They were very smart. They're hardworking, but they're very, very pragmatic. They know their game. They know how to play your game. She outplayed you, and now the only way you can try to catch up is by trying
the board over. Yeah.
Exactly. You flip the board over. You try to destroy it, and.
and this is another thing that people need to think about, because you listen to the U.S. president, senators, people in the media across the U.S. They're always talking about how we have to stop the rise of China. We have to contain China. Think about what you're saying. What is wrong with China rising? It has a bigger population. It has a bigger industrial base. Has a huge economy. It's in many ways has already surpassed the U.S. Why shouldn't it be more powerful than the U.S.? It has almost 5 times as many people. Why shouldn't it have more money, more power, more influence if it's just a bigger country? Do you see you see? Trying to think of Portugal. Do you see Portugal? Tearing their hair out and beating their chest over why is the United States more powerful than us? I mean, it's just common sense, and this is the problem with the American ruling class. They are out of touch with the reality, and they just look at reality. There is nothing wrong with the U.S. being the second most powerful nation on Earth. Once India gets itself organized, then it'll be number 3. But what is wrong with that? And it's because the people running the U.S. right now come from a history of just racist imperialists, and that is all they know. Hold on a second. So there's 2 questions here that are related. What has the U.S. promised Xi? He would not go to the U.S. unless it was worth it. Taiwan related. The U.S. might tolerate the KMT to win next January. And it's funny because President Biden said to China, don't interfere in Taiwan's elections. As Angelo explained, the U.S. for many years, decades actually, has been interfering in the elections. And then there's this question, which is very similar. What do you think drove the Chinese to agree to this meeting? And my answer to these questions would be, whatever the U.S. promised China, I don't think China expects the U.S. to uphold it. Look at the Minsk agreements. Look at the U.S. One China policy. The U.S. has a One China policy where they don't recognize Taiwan independence. They recognize it as part of China, and yet all they do is undermine China's sovereignty regarding Taiwan. So no matter what the U.S. promised, they're not gonna keep the promise.
Well, they call it, Brian. They call it a strategic ambiguity. So how can you trust someone that is saying, "Well, I'm dealing with the part of China that belongs to you, but it's for us it's strategic ambiguity." It's it's very vague but very clear at the same time. It's just you don't mean what you say. That's very clear. You don't mean what you say. Yes. And nobody's you see many countries they're not trusting the US because they break accords. How many accords they broke? How many proliferation treaties? I mean, every time and I think the latest was the Minsk agreement. When you have that exposed, and they say clearly we were not meant to respect that treaty. So the problem, my question is, what is next? You see the same now we have the case of Israel, and you realize that all those treaties, there was Camp David, Oslo Accord, and so on. You realize that all those accords, they were to gain buy time, because ultimately you still had people leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu showing the picture, the map, and guess what? There was no Palestine in the map. Gaza was gone, Cisjordania was gone. Why? Because it's been clear the whole time. Since 1948, those Zionists, they were always clear about what they wanted. There was actually 2 types of Zionists. One was to wipe out completely Palestine really quick. Palestinians gone. Sinai. Oh, the other ones was, let's do it close. It's gonna take time, but we're not gonna rush. And you see the results. Now you think they are going to make another agreement? Let's do a peace convention. We do another Oslo. But fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I mean, how many times the Palestinians have been fooled? And sadly, again, it's hard to say, but and I think I'm amongst the most anti-Zionist, because it's disgusting when I see what is happening. Okay, well, there's realpolitik, and I feel these days that the Palestinian cause, it's they've given up. The whole region have given up on Palestine. The Arab world is going along with Israel, and just because it's a minor evil. It's just you're buying peace, and the collateral damage is Palestine. Sadly, and I think we need to be really careful. A lot of people are actually looking at what is happening there as wishful thinking. It's one thing that you say, well, you know what, I'm glad the IDF got kicked, but it's just they're fighting a war.
it was a
Yeah.
pretext served to Israel on a silver platter, an
Absolutely.
excuse to just erase Gaza, and I think that's what we're watching. But that is a topic for another
Yeah.
live
Huge,
stream.
too big, too big.
Yeah, and but you mentioned the incremental erasure of the Palestinian people, and remember the U.S. client regime in Ukraine. They wanted to erase the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, and they were working on that, and the U.S. was backing them. So people have to remember, the U.S. has one playbook, and they go to it everywhere, all around the globe, and this is what empire does: it divides and it conquers. Anywhere you see trouble being stirred, I assure you, the empire of that age is somehow behind it. This question, I think this is a good question, Angela. Maybe you have some insight on this. Is the Taiwan elections making the U.S. nervous as the opposition parties are joining together? You kind of talked about that. I mean, you can't predict the future, but what are the prospects of the DPP being removed and someone more sane, at least interested in the status quo, taking power? And what if the DPP wins again? Because again, the U.S. is more involved in Taiwan's elections than China is, and Taiwan is part of China. I mean, the irony of that.
Again, historically, KMT was more pragmatic. We had some leaders in the past that were actually pretty much leading towards independence. But I would say the last leader of Kuomintang was president was Maing Zhou. And Maing Zhou, at some point, that was actually in 2014 or 2015, he met with the Xi Jinping in Singapore. And at that time, there was a free trade agreement between Taiwan and China. And what happened in 2014, you had this sunflower revolution. So they broke this accord. And since 2014, the whole relationship, and especially with Tsai Ing-wen from DPP coming into power, this whole relationship when it was a downfall, gradual downfall. And that was at the expense of Taiwan because 60% of Taiwan's economy depends with the mainland. So again, I don't know what is the influence that Maing Zhou has, but recently actually Maing Zhou went to mainland China, and he said clearly that the future of Taiwan was about reunification with the mainland. So again, but I would be very careful because we had some surprises, especially we just mentioned just before. Marcos was supposed to have a pragmatic approach because he was the protege of Duterte. And guess what? He's the worst one. Probably the opposition that Duterte had was not as bad as Marcos.
It's a close call, I think, considering what he is now doing. But you make a lot of good points. I think China is very patient. They know time is on their side. What they want to avoid, they're not in a rush for reunification. What they want to avoid is the U.S. doing what it's doing everywhere else, what it's doing in Eastern Europe, and then also to just the rest of Europe, with Russia just destroying it. They cannot get their way with Russia, and they're throwing all of Europe into the fire, trying anyway. They've divided and destroyed the Middle East for decades now. What China does not want is Taiwan to be the next victim. They want reunification to be peaceful. They know eventually it will happen. And so, even if the DPP wins the election, I think China's just going to remain patient and just do whatever it has to do to avoid Taiwan being burned to the ground like the U.S. has done to Ukraine and everywhere else. We might have a chance to end this at almost exactly an hour. I mean, 3 minutes over is pretty good. We got some of the questions. You have any last closing thoughts?
I would say, remember the title of the RAND Corporation paper about Russia. It was extending Russia.
Extending Russia, yes.
Actually, just think about it. What is happening right now is extending the U.S. They have two fronts. So if there's a second front happening in the Middle East, then it's over. They cannot have a third front. And actually, the risk that the U.S. has is actually to to be kicked out by two countries. I would say one is Iraq and one is Syria. I think they're panicking now. It's not so much. I think Israel can deal with the two fronts, Hamas and Hezbollah, but they're really scared about, being kicked out from Syria and Iraq. Because guess what? If they lose in Ukraine, they're kicked out from Syria and Iraq. Well, just think about their allies. They might start thinking, you know what? We don't want to collapse alongside with the US. I mean, very seriously, this is a humiliation. Look at how, I think we've been looking at the wrong direction. Is it Iran or is it the fear of losing together Iraq and Syria? Because now they're being attacked.
In addition to Ukraine, having already lost Ukraine.
Imagine, and that is after huge humiliation in Afghanistan. How many humiliation can you take? I mean, Western media, they can whitewash everything and paint it nicely, but you know what? You can't fool people. Afghanistan was a huge humiliation. Ukraine is about to be a huge humiliation. Well, then Syria, Iraq,
Yes, and Angelo, you cited the Rand Corporation 2019 paper extending Russia, and they said if we do manage to provoke Russia into some sort of large-scale conflict, it will be a complete disaster for the United States. And they were talking about the confidence of, they call them U.S. allies, obviously U.S. proxies, the confidence either being boosted or broken by the outcome of Ukraine. So you're exactly right. That is what they were saying back in 2019. You have to imagine the panic in Washington right now when they see all of these problems multiplying. But that's what always happens to empires. It always happens where you've overextended yourself. The foundation, the strong foundation that you built your empire on top of no longer exists. Everything is crumbling. Your problems become exponential toward the end. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I always say, China and the multipolar worlds, they're trying to be patient. They're trying to build and trade. They recognize the primacy of the nation state, and who will win? Their ability to build the world up, or the U.S.'s ability to try to divide and destroy everything as their empire collapses. That's where the battle lines really are. And I stand with multipolarism. Angelo, surely you do, and I think most of our audience does. And we need to just keep getting this information out there. We have to try to stop the collective West from tricking people, not just in the West, but around the world, into these ridiculous, unnecessary conflicts that are designed to just impair progress for absolutely everyone, and to give them the ability, if we, they're getting weaker, if we can make the whole world weaker than us, our weakness, then we can still be in charge. I think that is the mentality. Thank you, Angelo, for joining me today. We did this a day earlier, or we usually do it on Friday, but thank you for joining me, Angelo. Thank you, everyone in the comment section, for joining in. If you're watching this after the live stream, check the video description for all the places you can find and follow Angelo's work, as well as my work. Like and share, subscribe if you can. It does help. Thank you all, and until next time, bye for now.